Dead bones lived. God spoke power.
Chapter 1. The Gate of Silence. In a land far from home, where sorrow clung to every alley and street, the prophet Ezekiel lived among a broken people. He was not just any man, he was a servant chosen by God. And yet, even those handpicked by the divine must sometimes walk through shadows darker than night. Babylon was not just a foreign empire, it was a prison of the soul. There were no temple songs here, no sense of holy incense, no promises in the wind. Only the bitter taste of exile. The people of Israel had once been the chosen ones, the treasured nation, but now they were scattered captives, stripped of land, culture, and hope. Their temple had been crushed, their identity stolen, and their faith silenced under the boots of empire. Ezekiel often fell to his knees at night, surrounded by the hum of a land that wasn't his, and asked the question many had whispered in despair: Lord, have you left us? Have we fallen too far to be found? One morning, a morning like any other, sunrise flat and still, no wind to speak of, Ezekiel felt something stir. Not in the sky, not in the air, but deep within him, like a gentle hand pressing upon his shoulder. It wasn't fear, it was presence, a presence too powerful to be human, yet too intimate to be anything but divine. Before he could breathe a word, he was lifted, whether in body or spirit, he could not tell. The earth beneath him blurred, and when his vision cleared, he was no longer standing in Babylon. He stood in the midst of a vast and terrifying landscape, a valley stretching beyond the horizon, filled with nothing but bones, sun-bleached, brittle, silent bones. They were scattered across the ground like the aftermath of a forgotten war. No birds called, no insects buzzed. The silence was deafening, and Ezekiel's every step crunched upon remnants of a people long dead. He didn't know where he was, he didn't know why he'd been brought there, but the dread that gripped his heart whispered that this was no ordinary place. This was a graveyard without graves, a field where life had not just died, it had been erased. Then the voice came. It didn't come from a direction or a shape. It came from within and beyond all at once, the voice of the Lord. Son of man, can these bones live? The question pierced Ezekiel's heart. He looked around at the lifeless remains. Bones didn't just represent death, they represented the finality of it. No muscle, no flesh, no breath, just dust. But Ezekiel was a prophet, not a philosopher. He had seen the Lord part seas and rain fire, feed the hungry and humble kings. He had learned not to speak from doubt, but from reverence. And so, with eyes still fixed on the valley of desolation, he answered, O Lord God, you alone know. It was a simple response, but in that moment, it meant everything. It wasn't just an answer, it was surrender. It was faith that admitted human logic could go no further, and that what remained belonged to God alone. That question, can these bones live, was more than rhetorical. It was a divine invitation, an invitation to believe that even in a valley filled with nothing but loss, resurrection was still possible. And just like that, Ezekiel understood. He wasn't there to mourn the dead. He was there to witness what only the living God could do. What came next would shake the foundations of his soul. Chapter 2. The Command in the Darkness. The silence in the valley felt like a weight pressing against Ezekiel's chest. There was no sound, only the crushing stillness of a place untouched by life. But then, like a spark in the void, the voice of the Lord spoke again. Not comfort, not explanation, a command. Prophesy over these bones, the voice said. Say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Ezekiel blinked. His breath caught in his throat. Speak to bones, to things that couldn't hear, couldn't move, couldn't even hope. The absurdity of the command was undeniable. Yet Ezekiel didn't argue. He didn't ask how or why. He didn't appeal to reason or experience. He knew that when the Lord gave an order, it wasn't meant to be evaluated. It was meant to be obeyed. He stepped forward, his feet crunching over ancient remains, and lifted his voice. O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. His words echoed through the valley like thunder in a forgotten canyon. They fell upon the bones as if tossed into a void. And then, a sound. It began low, like a soft rattle beneath the earth, but it grew. Louder, sharper. Bones began to tremble. Then they moved. A single femur rolled across the ground. A skull tilted upward as if listening. Then chaos. Bones leapt from their resting places. Drawn to one another as if summoned by an invisible force, Ezekiel watched in awe as rib cages snapped into place, spines aligned, arms and legs connected, knees bent and straightened. It was like watching death being rewound, like time itself was folding back upon these remains. What had been chaos became structure. What had been remnants of the past became the architecture of life. But the vision wasn't finished. As Ezekiel stood frozen, sinews and tendons formed over the bones. Muscles swelled into being, covering the frames like living fabric. Skin stretched across flesh, shaping human forms from head to toe. No longer skeletons, they now lay before him as fully formed people. But they weren't alive. The bodies, thousands of them, lay still as statues, perfectly formed, completely motionless. No breathing, no blinking, no pulse. They looked human, but something vital was missing. Ezekiel could feel it in his bones. These were not yet men. They were shells, empty, silent, and then the voice returned. Prophesy to the breath, the Lord said. Say to the breath, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. It was a new command, and perhaps more mysterious than the first. Speak not to people, not even to bones, but to breath, to wind. How could something invisible obey? Yet again, Ezekiel didn't question. He didn't hesitate. He stretched out his arms to the sky and cried out, Come, O breath, come from the four winds. Breathe upon these lifeless ones, that they may live. And the wind came. It didn't howl or roar. It moved with authority. It flowed through the valley, unseen yet undeniable. The breath of life, the Spirit of God, swept over the still bodies, and in an instant, everything changed. A flicker, a gasp, a shudder, then movement. One body sat up, then another. Arms stretched, eyes opened, lungs filled, chests rose and fell with new breath. The silence was shattered by the sound of breathing. Thousands of inhalations and exhalations. Heartbeats finding rhythm. Voices beginning to murmur. Feet shifting, hands lifting. Before Ezekiel now stood not corpses, but an army. A vast, living army, brought back from the brink of nothingness. Ezekiel stared at them overcome. Not with fear, but with awe. This wasn't horror, it was holiness. He had seen death reversed, impossibility undone. And all of it had begun not with strategy, not with force, but with a question, and a prophet willing to answer. The Lord's voice came once more. Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. The meaning struck Ezekiel like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just about bones. This was about his people. The Israelites, scattered, broken, hopeless, just like the bones that had littered this valley. This vision was not just a miracle. It was a message. They say, our bones are dried up. Our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. Ezekiel's heart ached. That was exactly what his people believed. They weren't just in exile. They were spiritually dead. They had forgotten who they were, forgotten who God was, forgotten that the story wasn't over. But God had not forgotten them. Prophesy to them, the Lord said. Say, behold, I will open your graves and raise you from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel, and I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live. Tears welled in Ezekiel's eyes. These weren't just poetic words. This was a declaration of war, against despair, against death, against the finality of failure. God wasn't just going to bring his people home. He was going to bring them back to life. And Ezekiel knew, in the deepest parts of his soul, that what he had just seen was only the beginning. Chapter 3, when breath enters the bones. The valley no longer felt empty. The echo of silence had been broken. Where once there had been only death, now stood a mighty army, alive, breathing, standing shoulder to shoulder like warriors preparing for battle. But Ezekiel knew this wasn't about warfare. It was about something far deeper. This was a resurrection, a miracle of both body and soul. He stood motionless, letting the sight before him imprint itself into his mind. These weren't just bodies, returned to life. They were a symbol, a living message from the Lord to his people, a promise made. Flesh, hope reborn from dust. And yet, even as he looked at them, Ezekiel knew the vision wasn't only about what stood before his eyes. It was about what lay buried inside his people. Because long before their bones were dried out in the sun, the Israelites had lost something else, their spirit. The voice of the Lord returned, not booming but steady, like a truth that could not be silenced. Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost, we are cut off completely. Ezekiel felt those words like a punch to the chest, because he had heard them before, not from God, but from his own people. He had seen the hollow look in their eyes, heard the sorrow in their voices. It wasn't just that they'd lost their land or their temple. They had lost their belief that God was still with them. They believed they were too far gone, too broken to be healed, too lost to be found. But God disagreed. Prophesy to them, the Lord said, and tell them, behold, I will open your graves. I will raise you up from your graves, O my people, and I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Graves. That's how they felt, buried in sorrow, trapped by regret, entombed in disappointment. And now God was saying, I will open them, not just metaphorically, not as a temporary comfort, but as a declaration of deliverance. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live. The Lord continued, and I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it. Ezekiel didn't just hear those words. He carried them like fire inside his bones. They weren't just a prophecy, they were a lifeline, not only to a people in exile, but to anyone who's ever felt like they've fallen too far to rise again. The valley, the bones, the breath, it was all a portrait of restoration. And the message was clear, nothing is too dead for God to resurrect. In the days that followed, Ezekiel returned to the people with a new voice. He didn't speak of judgment, though it had been earned. He didn't speak of blame, though it could have been cast. He spoke of life, of a God who had not abandoned them, but was waiting for them to believe again. The people listened, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Some with hope, some with skepticism, many with a cautious curiosity. But no one could deny the fire in Ezekiel's voice or the conviction in his eyes. He told them about the vision, about the valley, about the command to speak to bones, about the wind, the holy breath that gave lifeless bodies the gift of motion and meaning. He told them what it meant, that even in exile, even in disgrace, God had not revoked his promise. The same God who created the world from nothing could create life where there was none. All he needed was a heart willing to believe. It wasn't long before something began to shift among the people, not politically, not economically, but spiritually. Where once there was despair, there was now a whisper of hope. Where once there was silence, there were songs, timid at first, then louder. Families began gathering again in the evenings, not to mourn their situation, but to pray for the future. Children started learning the scriptures their parents had once tucked away in grief. Elders recited the promises of old, and somehow they didn't sound so distant anymore. The fire that had burned in Ezekiel's bones was catching. But this wasn't the kind of revival with banners and trumpets. It was quiet, organic, a spark in the ashes. It was the kind of change that happens deep inside, before anything changes on the outside. Still, Ezekiel knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. One night, long after the campfires had died down and only the stars lit the sky, Ezekiel stood alone. He lifted his hands to heaven and prayed, not for a miracle, but in thanksgiving for what had already begun. Lord, he whispered, you asked me if the bones could live. I didn't know then, but now I've seen it, not just in the valley, but in my people. He paused, and in myself, because that was the truth. He, too, had been buried in sorrow. He, too, had wondered if God was still listening. But now he knew, hope doesn't come from circumstances. It comes from the one who breathes life into what the world calls dead. And so Ezekiel stood in the stillness, listening for the wind, not just in the trees, but in his spirit, because he knew it now more than ever. The breath of God changes everything. Chapter 4, The Journey of Faith. The days after Ezekiel's vision were unlike any he had lived before. Something in him had changed permanently. He wasn't just a prophet carrying a message. He had become a man marked by fire, a man who had seen death undone and hope reborn in the most impossible place. That fire didn't burn out, it burned through him, and wherever he walked, it lit others too. The people of Israel were still in exile. Babylon still ruled. Their temple was still in ruins, their land still far away. But something was happening beneath the surface, something deeper than politics or geography. They were starting to believe again. Ezekiel walked among them, listening more than speaking. And what he heard surprised him. There were whispers of hope. A woman who had lost her husband began singing lullabies to her children again. An old priest dusted off the scrolls of the Torah and began reading them aloud at night. Young men gathered not to fight or complain, but to ask, "What do you think God meant when he said he would open our graves?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. A slow, sacred awakening, and Ezekiel watched it all with quiet reverence. He didn't rush it. He didn't try to control it. He simply reminded them, again and again, God is not finished. This is just the beginning. One evening, as the sun was dipping below the horizon and casting long orange shadows across the plains, Ezekiel stood before a small crowd gathered outside the worker camps. They had come not out of obligation, but hunger, a hunger for something greater than survival. He began to speak. "I stood in a valley once," he said, "a place where nothing lived. Bones covered the ground like dust. No trees. No wind. Just silence." The people leaned in. They'd heard bits and pieces before, but there was something in his voice tonight, something deeper, heavier. And then, he continued, "God asked me, 'Can these bones live?' And I answered, 'Lord, only you know.'" That was the moment everything changed. He told them about the shaking, the bones rattling together like thunder, the way flesh reformed over what was lost. He described how breath entered lifeless bodies and how a silent graveyard turned into a living army. But then he paused. "That vision wasn't just for me," he said softly. "It was for you, for all of us." Eyes widened, some filled with tears. "You think you're forgotten, that God's promises have expired, that he's moved on. But I'm telling you, he hasn't. Your bones are not too dry. Your spirit is not too far gone. He can bring you back. He will bring you back." There was no applause, no shouting, just stillness, the kind of stillness that happens when truth sinks in. That night, round their fires, the people didn't talk about Babylon. They talked about bones, about breath, about a God who revives the dead. And as they did, Ezekiel knew something sacred was taking root. Weeks later, Ezekiel had another vision. It didn't come like thunder this time, but like a whisper in the wind. He stood in a desert, a vast, cracked wasteland with no signs of life. No bones, no bodies, just dust. But then God spoke again. "Do you see this place?" Ezekiel nodded. "This is where nothing grows, nothing survives. It is beyond restoration." Then came the surprise. "Now watch what I do." Suddenly, the wind shifted. Clouds gathered. Rain began to fall, not in torrents, but in gentle, soaking waves. The ground began to darken, to drink it in. Then, from the cracks in the earth, green began to emerge, tiny shoots, then stems, then blooms. In minutes, what had been a wasteland had become a field of color. Wildflowers danced in the breeze. A stream trickled through the center. Birds returned to the air. Ezekiel gasped. "This," said the Lord, "is what I do not only with bones, but with nothing. I don't just resurrect the dead. I create life from emptiness." When Ezekiel awoke, his hands were trembling. The vision was clear. The message was simple. Hope wasn't just for the broken, it was for the barren. And so, he went to the people again, not with fire this time, but with rain. He told them about the desert, about the seeds, about the stream. And once again, something shifted. They didn't just hope to survive anymore. They began to hope for beauty, for joy, for abundance. A girl who had never seen her homeland drew pictures of Jerusalem and hung them in her family's tent. An old scribe began writing new psalms. Even the skeptical began to ask, what if God truly is doing something new? One day, a child came to Ezekiel, barely 9 years old, with dirt-stained hands and eyes too wise for his age. "Sir," the boy asked, "do you think God still wants to use us? I mean, we've been here so long. We messed up. We forgot him." Ezekiel knelt down, looked him straight in the eyes. "God doesn't wait for perfect people," he said. "He brings breath to dry bones." He plants gardens in deserts. He uses the forgotten to remind the world that nothing is beyond redemption. The boy nodded, biting his lip. So we're still his people. Ezekiel smiled. You were never not his people. That night, Ezekiel stood beneath the stars and raised his hands toward heaven. I don't know when you'll bring us home, he whispered, but I know this much. You're already bringing us back to life. The stars shimmered above him, and the wind carried his prayer into the night. Chapter 5. The Wind of Transformation. The valley was long behind him, but Ezekiel carried it everywhere he went. Not in his sandals or in the folds of his robe, but in his spirit. What he had witnessed wasn't a what-I'm vision. It was a living call, a commission, a promise too big to leave behind. The people of Israel were still far from home, still living under foreign rule, still surrounded by the ruins of their once great identity. But something had changed. A new pulse was beating in their community, a rhythm of hope that no longer whispered, but sang. It began in the small things. A father repaired his family's tattered tent with care and purpose, humming an old hymn as he worked. Mothers began teaching their children the Psalms again, not as distant poetry, but as truth they could stand on. Craftsmen and elders who had nearly given up began speaking of the future with words like when, not if, and in the center of it all, Ezekiel watched, not as a leader issuing commands, but as a witness to a growing flame. But the flame was fragile. Some days the old doubts returned. After all, they were still in exile. Babylon still ruled, and Jerusalem, a distant ruin, Ezekiel understood. Even when bones come together and flesh returns, even after breath has been restored, the journey isn't over. Resurrection is one thing. Living like you've been raised is another. He continued to teach, not with lofty sermons, but with stories, dreams, visions. He told them not just what God had done, but what God was still doing, what God was still promising. One morning, after a restless night of prayer, Ezekiel stood before a small gathering in the workers' district. The crowd was mixed, young, old, men, women, skeptical eyes, and tear-streaked faces. They came not for entertainment or ritual, but because they needed to believe. He looked at them, then lifted his voice, not loud, not dramatic, but clear. Sometimes, he began, we wait for God to split the sky, to shake the ground, to send armies or angels. But more often, God sends wind. They blinked, unsure. He smiled gently. You can't see the wind. You can't grab it or hold it, but you can feel it. It moves you. It changes the air. And when it comes from God, it changes more than that. It changes you. He paused, letting that settle. You remember the bones, but do you remember the wind? It came after everything looked alive, after the flesh, after the form. Because it's possible to look like you're living and still be hollow. Heads nodded slowly. It was the wind, the breath of God, that gave life. Not breath like ours, not just air. Spirit. That's what we need. He wasn't just speaking to them. He was speaking to himself. That night, Ezekiel had another vision. He was in a field, dry and cracked, nothing but dust beneath his feet. But it wasn't a valley of bones this time. There were no corpses, no remains, just emptiness. He felt a familiar presence. The Lord was near. This, the Lord said, is not death. This is worse. This is barrenness. Death means something once lived. Barrenness means nothing ever did. Ezekiel swallowed hard. What can live here? He asked. The Lord didn't answer. Instead, he breathed, and the wind came, not a roar, not a storm, just a steady, invisible current sweeping across the dust. Ezekiel watched. At first, nothing. Then, movement. Tiny green blades pierced the earth. Then stems. Then flowers. Water trickled from dry stones. Birds filled the air. What had been desolation became a garden. This, said the Lord, is what I do with nothing. If I can create beauty from emptiness, how much more can I do with those who carry my name? Ezekiel awoke with tears on his face. It was no longer about the bones. It was about the breath. About how God didn't just want to revive his people, but to fill them, to dwell in them, to use them as vessels of his spirit, to plant gardens where there had been deserts. He told the people the next morning, not with drama, but with fire. You think God is waiting for things to get better, he said. But God is not waiting. He's moving, even now. Even in this place. Especially in this place, they listened. And this time, something deeper shifted. People didn't just start believing in a return to Israel. They began believing in something even greater, a return to God's presence. Right where they were, they prayed differently. They served one another with new grace. The Word of God was no longer tradition. It was oxygen. And among them, Ezekiel walked quietly, humbly, gratefully. He no longer needed the valley or the bones. He had seen what breath could do. One afternoon, a young girl came up to him. "Sir," she asked, "will we always be in exile?" He knelt to her level, smiled warmly. "No," he said. "One day we'll go home." "But when?" she asked. He placed a hand over her heart. "When you carry home inside you. Even exile loses its power." She blinked. "I don't understand." "You will," he said. She ran off to play, and Ezekiel turned his eyes to the sky. "Lord," he whispered, "your wind has started something, and it will not stop until it has finished." And he believed that with every fiber of his being. Chapter 6. Glory in the bones. Years passed. The city of Babylon still loomed large, but the people of Israel walked differently now. Their posture was straighter. Their eyes no longer scanned the ground in defeat. Something had changed, not in their surroundings, but inside them. It wasn't just Ezekiel's vision anymore. It had become part of who they were, part of their story. The image of the dry bones, the shaking earth, the breath of life, it lived in their hearts. Their children knew it. Their elders whispered it like a prayer. The valley had become more than a place. It had become a promise, and yet Ezekiel knew there was still more. One night, as the desert wind howled low beyond the camp, Ezekiel sat beside the embers of a fading fire. He gazed at the stars, so many, so constant, and whispered, "Lord, what now?" And the Lord answered, not with thunder, but with presence. He spoke not of bones this time, nor of winds, nor of deserts. He spoke of graves, Son of Man. He said, "They say, our bones are dried up. Our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. But I tell you, I will open their graves. I will raise them from those graves and bring them back to the land I promised." Ezekiel held his breath. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't a parable. It was a vow, a holy oath sealed in the breath of the Almighty. "I will put my spirit within them," the Lord continued, "and they will live. And when I do this, they will know, truly know, that I am the Lord." The prophet's heart thudded in his chest. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't even just about restoration. This was about revelation. A people who would know their God not only through miracles or stories, but through encounter, through the Spirit dwelling in them like breath in their lungs. He bowed low. The very next day, news came like a rushing river. Babylon had fallen. A new king now ruled. And with him came an astonishing decree. The exiles were free to return to their homeland. The people of Israel wept. They laughed through their tears. They packed what little they had and began the long journey home. But they didn't return the same way they had come. They left Babylon not as victims, but as witnesses, people who had stared down hopelessness and seen God's face in the dust. As they walked through deserts and valleys and over hills, they told the story again and again. Do you remember the vision? Yes. The bones, the rattling, the breath, and someone would always whisper, "We are those bones." And we're living proof. The journey was long, but it was filled with joy. They sang songs as they marched, not the songs of sorrow they once wept by the rivers of Babylon, but songs of triumph, songs of resurrection. Children who had been born in captivity now saw the land their parents had described. With tears in their eyes, the weak were carried, the old were honored. And through it all, Ezekiel walked among them, the quiet fire of his vision still burning. At night, he would sit by their tents, tell stories by firelight, and not just the story of the bones, but of the breath, of the God who doesn't just restore the broken, but makes all things new. He reminded them, God didn't bring us out of graves just to set us free. He brought us out so he could live in us. That was the point. Not just freedom, not just land, but intimacy. God wasn't looking for subjects. He was looking for sons and daughters, people who would walk with him, not just serve him. One evening, a teenage boy approached him shyly. "Ezekiel, I've heard the story. I believe it. But what if I still feel empty? What if I'm alive, but not really living? Ezekiel looked at him long and hard. Then you ask God for his breath. Every day, if you have to. You ask him to fill you with his spirit. Because being truly alive doesn't come from strength or knowledge. It comes from him. The boy nodded slowly. And he'll do it. Ezekiel smiled. He's already begun. Years later, when the temple had been rebuilt, and the people had once again taken root in the promised land, some would say the miracle had passed. But those who had walked with Ezekiel knew better. The miracle wasn't just in what God had done, it was in what he continued to do. Because even as cities were restored, it was hearts that bore the true mark of resurrection. They didn't speak of dry bones as legend. They spoke of it like legacy. Because when you've watched death come undone, when you've felt the wind of God move through a lifeless place, when you've seen an entire nation rise again, you don't just believe in miracles. You live like one. And long after Ezekiel was gone, his story remained, not just in scrolls or synagogues, but in campfires and kitchens, in songs and in the whispers of prayer. Generations would ask, who was Ezekiel? And the answer would come, he was the man who told the bones to live, and they listened. But those who truly understood knew something even deeper. Ezekiel was the man who dared to believe when everything looked dead. And because he did, we are still breathing.